Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm Dan Oppenheimer, Central Texas correspondent of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the podcast today is Freddie deBoer. Freddie is the author of 3 books, or 2, with a third almost out. The first is The Cult of Smart, How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. Then he wrote How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement, and he has a new novel coming out in October, The Mind Reels. Freddie has another book under contract about the ways in which certain disorders, in particular mental health disorders and forms of disability, are becoming anchors of personal identity in a way that is bizarre and, I think, in his opinion, mostly destructive. Freddie is also, and I'd say more influentially, a longtime blogger and now Substacker who has carved out a niche for himself as a left-wing critic of liberals and of the left, with a particular emphasis on the characteristic flaws and sins of identity politics and what we now call wokeness. So this rhetorical space, the anti-woke rhetorical space, is a fairly well-saturated one at this point, but Freddie is really one of the OG left-wing critics of contemporary leftist thought and practice. He was there before almost anyone else, at least in this most recent iteration of the cycle. And I think, for my money, he and Wesley Yang are probably the 2 writers who've had the most influence on how liberals and leftists talk about these issues, possibly how conservatives do too. And this is the case even though, and Freddie and I talk about this, he's far from a household name. A lot of people who are probably saying things that descend, that have his writing and thinking in their DNA, don't even know who he is. So he's one of those people who, if you know, but most people don't know, and that includes a fair number of people in, say, academia and the media. And there are various reasons for his relative obscurity, and I should emphasize that it's only relative. He has 66,000 subscribers on Substack, makes a good living. A lot of them are paid subscribers. He's been read, I'm sure, by millions and millions of people. But the relative obscurity, the reasons for it, I'd say the main ones are these 3. The first, and he's written a lot about this, is that he struggles with bipolar disorder. And in 2017, in the grips of a manic episode, he kind of blew up. He blew his life up. He made some libelous accusations against another journalist. And after that, after he sort of had this episode and did some unpleasant things, he voluntarily disappeared from public life for the next few years. And the scandal, even though he's back in the mix, the scandals made him sort of persona non grata at a lot of publications. So that's reason 1. Reason 2, which is not wholly unconnected, is that he's just a prickly personality. He takes no prisoners in his writing. He attacks people who might otherwise be his ideological or just social allies, and he's just temperamentally allergic to playing the game at all, and often seems to sort of go out of his way to do the opposite of playing the game. And then the third reason, or just his politics, which don't really align with anyone else's politics, which just makes it harder to find a home, particularly an institutional home in media, in journalism. So he's a Marxist who seems to be most animated by his disgust with many other people on the left. He's somebody who has struggled with severe psychiatric disorder, who really detests the left-flavored movements and ideologies that tend to be associated with people who have mental health issues and become advocates in that space. Unlike so many anti-woke types, which is another ecosystem he could potentially find a home in, he's both a hardcore critic of Israel and a staunch ally of sort of pro-trans advocates. He's a skeptic of AI, LLM, and on and on. In every space where he could find a kind of natural community, he tends to differ from the other people in that community in some key way. So he fits in nowhere. That's a lot of what we talk about in this conversation, his difficulties fitting in for various reasons. We also talk about my feelings about and for him. I don't know him, or I didn't know him at all, never spoken to him before this conversation, but I have been reading Freddie closely for a long time, I think more than a decade. And over the years, as I explained to him, I've developed a fairly strong parasocial attachment to him. I worry about him. I get frustrated with him. I have thoughts on what he should and shouldn't write about, how he should live his life. I theorize about his psyche. All this is happening in my own head. So this is my opportunity to unload many of my thoughts about Freddie to Freddie, and he is a gracious recipient of them, and we have a really interesting conversation about them. Some housekeeping things. Many good episodes of the podcast coming up after this one. Journalist Brady Dale and I talk about the ideologies of cryptocurrency. Brady has been covering that industry. He's an OG reporter on the crypto industry. Matt Dinneman and I talk about his science fiction series, Dungeon Crawler Carl, 7 installments of which I burned through earlier this year. I think there's another 3 on the way, ultimately. Sam Kahn and David Sessions and I talk about a lot of different shit. Ross Bark and Alex Perez and I talk about baseball, literature, and life. Ross and Alex are both former baseball players. And Lillian Fishman and I talk about pornography, romance, love, relationships. It's all good stuff. So this is my monthly paid episode. So you'll get about 25 minutes of my conversation with Freddie for free. And then for the rest, you'll need to become a paid subscriber, at least for the month. You'll notice at the end, if you get to the end of the conversation, that I'm introducing a new element of the podcast. I'm giving each guest I have on 3 lightning round questions. These may evolve over time, but my initial 3 are, who should I have on the podcast if I want to stay in touch with the deep currents of the contemporary American intellectual scene? Number 2 is, if they had to host a podcast, what would it be about? And then, who do they have an intense, unrequited parasocial relationship with? So my final housekeeping thing is I recently noticed that Terry Gross has a co-host on Fresh Air, Tanya Mosley. I guess this has been the case for the last year or two, but I just recently noticed. And just in general, Terry has a kind of I'm leaving the show soon vibe that she's been putting out. And so it put me into the mind of thinking about who should be the next Fresh Air host. I mean, Mosley is presumably going to be. She's solid. She's pretty good, as is longtime substitute host Dave Davies. But let's be honest, I'm the natural heir to the Fresh Air legacy. Or if not me specifically, then someone like me, which is to say not Tanya and Dave, who are kind of off-brand Terrys. It should be someone who has their own unique vibration, as Terry does. So I thought about launching a campaign via the podcast to anoint me as the next host of Fresh Air. But I realized that a more generative endeavor would just be to think through who out in the world of media and broadcasting, who would be more plausible candidates or left field candidates for the job. Who should be the next Terry Gross? So if you have any thoughts, send me an email. I'll offer some of my own. And if anybody sends me some good ones in future podcast episodes. So that's it for housekeeping. On to the conversation with Freddie. And have a good day. Freddie deBoer, welcome to Eminent Americans. You are hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by the cool kids of the media industry. I'm not sure if I'm one of them. I don't think I am, but I...
Have you ever been to Nick Denton's townhouse?
No, I've been nowhere remotely close to Nick Denton. I'm really not a member of the cool kids of the media in any sense, but I've written, as you have, for a variety of those publications. So I guess if you're not, then maybe I'm not.
I mean, that's also a wildly dated reference at this point. So, yeah.
Well, it's okay. It's my podcast. Yeah. So I don't know. I have a lot of things to talk about you, including I'm fascinated, but I don't want to get derailed too early. I want to get into your beef with Avais Aftab, who's a previous guest of mine on the podcast and somebody who I like a lot. So I'm curious kind of why you dislike him so much. But I actually wanted to start in a more cosmic sense. Where are you now in your career? And you just said to me, and I didn't know this was the case, that you kind of hated doing your newsletter. But like, you're one of those people who, for people who are in the industry or in certain parts of the industry, you've been around for a while, you're pretty known quantity. I think you're really a really influential voice in all sorts of spaces, but you're also one of those people who's, at one and the same time, obscure to people who aren't part of our world, right? So if I told, I was just thinking about this, if I told one of my oldest friends, who's a history professor at the University of New Hampshire, has published trade books, I bet he wouldn't know who you are. So you're kind of in that weird space where you're like super well known in one respect, but you're not really a household name. So like, who are you and where are you right now in the kind of arc of your career and your life?
Yeah, I mean, look, I am an objectively minor figure, even by the standards of internet celebrity. And to the extent that I'm known, it tends to be more for bad behavior than anything else. I do think that I have been influential among a certain slice of people who have a dramatically over representative influence on media. Right.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of people who are sort of media lifers who are very plugged in do, in fact, read me. Whether I have influence over them or not, who can say? I have been a pretty successful freelancer for 15 years, and I've published just about everywhere I could want to publish at this point. I've always said that most of freelancing for me is stamp collecting, meaning just putting the stamp in the book of places I haven't published before. So just last month, I was published in the Times of London, which I never had before, and that was fine. And if they asked me to again, I'd do it again. It's $500. It's not life-changing. I mean, one thing that I tell the kids out there who are foolish enough to try to do this is I always tell them, their presumption is always that status tracks with money, or money tracks with status. That like you get to this position and it's like, if you talk to where you can freelance for big places, and that's where you start making big money. And I tell them the big places don't pay very well because they don't have to, right? Because they think you're going to eat prestige, right? Like the last couple of pieces I've written for the New York Times, which I'll probably never do again, but the last couple of pieces I wrote for the New York Times, I think I got $800. I mean, it's not like,
I don't know if there's another profession, by the way. I mean, I've made some version of that observation. I don't know if there's another profession, by the way, where the disparity between the status and the pay is as great as it is in writing.
Yeah.
There probably is, but it's extraordinary, right? It's like you can be writing for millions of people can see your name and read your stuff, and you could be making $800 or something. And you probably put in a lot of time, and they edit the shit out of you too, right? At the Times, they often edit
the Times. I don't want to sort of fracture the conversation too quickly, but I have said multiple times that the Times appears to be, for one thing, they appear to have a mandate for just rather ridiculous over editing. They are just relentless. The last piece that I wrote, it had this sort of chipper junior young editor who was just like sort of ridiculously over editing everything. And as I said at the time, I was like, look, like, you hired me for my voice, and there's none of that left in this piece. And it's not just me saying this. I've talked to a bunch of other freelancers talking about this. So, I think one thing that we should say is that all freelancers complain about the New York Times privately. Almost none of them complain about the New York Times publicly because they don't want to lose the opportunity to publish with the New York Times.
Well, right? Paul Krugman, I don't mind fracturing a little bit, but it actually does relate to my point. I mean, Paul Krugman recently left for Substack and was very outspoken about the fact that even Paul Krugman, who is like one of their marquee columnists, who I think had been given a relatively free hand for many years, but maybe the more recent editorial regime came in and according to him, started editing him. So, I mean, when even Paul Krugman is getting edited to the point where he's going to leave and go to Substack. I mean, it is a thing. It's a real thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think Patrick Healy, is the name of the guy. I think he's the deputy opinion editor. And from the people I talked to in that building, this is probably his influence. Yeah, so look, it's like, I think Paul Krugman is a good example to pick because there is this apparent sort of Times effort to really dramatically devoice the pieces that they run and to sort of remove the individuality of the writer, which dovetails, I think, with what happened with Paul Krugman, which is, I think that the Times is at a place where it is now so dominant as a publication, so really hegemonic in terms of like, there's nothing that comes close that combines prestige with financial success like the New York Times, right? I mean, the Washington Post, I wouldn't be shocked if you told me that it kind of functionally fits, no longer exists within 3 years. Somebody would buy that IP and keep something going. But like, as a news gathering organization, it's mortally threatened, but it's just a Jeff Bezos vanity project that he doesn't like very much, right? Like that's a crazy world to live in.
Did you start when you were in grad school kind of just blogging? Is that how you first came into the sort of public awareness such as it is?
A little bit before grad school. I first started blogging in 2008. I just had nothing going on. It was sort of like the darkest couple of years of my life.
That's saying a lot, Freddie, given what I knew about your life, yeah.
Depending on how you want to, maybe at the time, not the darkest, but the sort of the most pointless and directionless and sort of hopeless in terms of not knowing what I was going to do. I had nothing going on. I was just working a series of shitty jobs. Like what I'd find on Craigslist or whatever. And so I was at the public library one day and I sort of on a whim started a blog. And I had sort of made myself known by being a pain in the ass in the comments of other people's blogs. And everyone's like, oh, just go write your own blog. And so I did. Yeah. And I think like my third piece or something somehow got in front of Andrew Sullivan. And this was like the very tail end of what was the sort of classic blogosphere years.
Yeah.
Most everybody of note had sort of decamped for traditional media at this point. But anyway, Andrew Sullivan shared it with his readership, which is obviously enormous. And from there on, it was off to the races. And I've sort of done a ton of freelancing since then, although I've never been a staff writer anywhere ever. So
let me give you my sense of the arc of your career from that time when you started, and you can sort of nuance it and correct it, which is, so I guess when did you start grad school? You got a PhD in rhetoric, right, at Purdue? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I was in a English department and in a writing and rhetoric program. My concentration was in writing assessment. So I was more on the sort of quantitative side. But yeah, I started my master's at the University of Rhode Island in September of 2009. I finished my PhD in May of 2015 at Purdue. Yeah.
So my sense is, okay, so you're in grad school for 6 years and you're sort of slowly building your profile. And then you had this, I'm not speaking out of turn because you've written a lot, you had this breakdown. You've struggled with bipolar disorder for a long time, and you had this breakdown kind of manic episode that was when you blew up your life to some extent. That was after grad school, right? Was that when you were working at
in Brooklyn College? Yes, that was 8 years ago. Last week, that was 2017, August of 2017.
So you got your PhD. You're making a name for yourself in writing. You're a complicated figure. People hate you. You sometimes pick fights. Sometimes fights happen to you. But you're in sort of good enough. You're in good enough standing in some sense that you keep writing, and you get this job. What are they, like alt-ac? You were running a program or something, like you're doing something in academia, but it's not teaching. And then you have this manic episode, and you kind of lay low for a while after that, right? Didn't you kind of lay low as a writer to some extent?
Yeah, I didn't publish a word for outside consumption for 3 years. I would periodically put a note on my personal website to just sort of say, hey guys, here's how I am. I'm recovering, whatever. But I didn't publish anything of note for 3 years. Yeah, so I had a contract with St. Martin's to publish my first book, which is a book that I'm very proud of and that also had a very difficult birth and could not possibly have been published under worse conditions in many ways.
That's a really good book, by the way. I like The Cult of Smart. I'll let you describe what it's about, but like, it's a really good book and one that's kind of influenced my thinking about education and the world a lot. Yeah, so you published that book. You've not given up on a career as a writer, but you're like, I need to get out of that space of sort of getting involved in sort of current events and mixing it up with people online. And
I had more or less given up on a career as a writer, but I had a book contract and I had taken their money. And when all of this happened, when I stopped being able to freelance, when I stopped, having that source of income, my income dropped by more than a third when that happened. And I was living in Brooklyn, right, on a public servant salary. I had already kind of been struggling financially after that. And so the only things that kept me afloat was this fairly modest advance that I had gotten from St. Martin's. And so I couldn't pay the advance back. So I had to write the book. And I'm glad that I did. But yeah, so, we went to sell the book and the guy who bought it was Adam Bellow, who is a sort of controversial figure.
Yeah.
Because he's a conservative, and he published
Saul Bellow's son, right?
Yeah, Saul Bellow's son. He published The Bell Curve, for example. They were offering by far the most money. I just don't believe that there's a taint from the publisher that goes on the author. I mean, I think that kind of guilt by association is one of the stupidest things that happens in media today. So I didn't, and he was a very good shepherd of books, whether you like his politics or not. So we signed with him, and then I think 4 months before the book has been written at all, really, he left St. Martin's under what felt like acrimonious circumstances. I don't really know the story, but so my book was immediately an orphan. St. Martin's, I have to give them all the credit in the world. The people that they assigned the book to after he left, they did their best, right? And they really did treat me very well. But literally, it was the last book ever on that imprint. And then, yeah, I was pretty sincerely dedicated to just moving on and working at CUNY. But unfortunately, number one, I was just awful at that job. So it was an administrative job, and I'm just not an administrator. I had sort of signed up to be the writing across the curriculum coordinator. So sort of doing writing and stuff that I care about. But I also had this sort of assessment hat that I would put on that was sort of, a big part of my official duties there. And no one at colleges who is on the faculty likes the assessment guy, no matter what it is. All the faculty were very polite to me, and they actually would praise me for being less heavy-handed than other people in the administration about this. But still, you're the sort of hand of the institution, sort of imposing itself in a way that they don't like. But then this psychiatric crisis happens, and it was sort of never the same after that. And even though it only happened a year into it, and I hung on for 3 more years, it was clear that I would never sort of be seen in the same way again. during COVID in 2020, spring of 2020, before the book came out, I was let go. But I was stuck. So it's COVID. I had no job. I had no money. And then suddenly I went from having great health insurance to no health insurance. And I had this very expensive condition to treat. And then Substack was like, hey, look, we'll give you an advance if you want to come write for us. And I just didn't have a choice. I mean, I was on the job market for like 9 or 10 months. And I just didn't get anything. I just could not find a job. And I was just like, the sort of St. Martin's money was running out. And I was like, I got to pay the rent. So I agreed to do Substack.
So for people who don't know, I mean, your public persona, your profile is as like the left-wing guy, the Marxist who critiques the left. A lot of the sort of posts you wrote that, went viral, or I think have had a lot of influence on the conversation, were critiques of whatever you want to call it, the woke left, the identitarian left, from what I think you would see as the kind of Marxist left, a sort of class first left. And I realize these are all kind of simplifications, but that was your public profile. I'm curious, when you're at CUNY, did the faculty there know that about you? Was that factored into reception at all? Or is it kind of what I was saying before, that like most academics actually aren't locked into these debates and these dialogues, and that wasn't part of what was going on at all in terms of your perception of you in your day job?
A handful of them, I think, were aware, but most of them weren't.
I mean, I remember you writing, I'm just looking at, jobs in construction or something like that. I mean, it was pretty, just economically, it was pretty desperate straits for you at that point.
The only real offer I got in 10 months of looking for jobs, which again is in the middle of a COVID job crunch or whatever. The only offer that I got was a job for a junk removal company. It wouldn't have even covered the rent even by itself with everything else. It annoys people that I say this, but it is just literally true that like, I just didn't really have any other option other than to write for money again. And the funny thing is, when people get mad that I sort of returned to writing as a profession, I mean, the reason why I had to is because those same people who get mad about it had worked so hard to sort of ruin my reputation if you did a Google search that no one would hire me. So it's like, what do you kind of played into that same problem yourself,
Yeah, it's interesting, right? You're saying no one would hire you even out in the kind of normie world because these days when you're thinking about hiring somebody, you just Google them, right? And your scandal was so, I mean, both this sort of actual scandal in which you said some, we don't need to kind of go over it again, but you said some kind of libelous things or potentially libelous things about somebody that
definitely, libelous,
libelous that weren't true, but also all the political stuff. So like, all the people who said nasty things about you, and there was just an immense digital paper trail of ways in which you were problematic. And I should say, you may know this or just have intuited this, I have been in sort of intense parasocial relationship to you for many years. I've been reading you for a long time. I've been thinking about you as a writer, but in some sense, to the extent one can know a person as a person. And it was this crazy situation thinking about you at that moment, because on the one hand, you're sort of persona non grata. On the other hand, and Substack figured this out, right, is like, people love to read you. There were all these people who were leaving money on the table in not hiring you. There were all these struggling magazines and newspapers who probably could have gotten you for a total bargain, right? Like somebody could have said, hey, Freddie, would you, and you're enormously prolific, right? So somebody could have said, hey, Freddie, could you write for us? And totally exploited you, right? For $50,000 a year or something like that. And they just would have made a lot of money off of you. And they're just leaving all this money sitting on the table because 10%, I guess, because of your psychiatric issues, but really 90% because of your politics. In 2020, peak woke or whatever like that. It was really because of your politics, and because if they hired you, there's all these people in their social circle who would have been mad at them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, like people get bored of me making the same point over and over again, but it is genuinely the case that one of the things that has happened to media in the 21st century is just that this sort of structures of online connectivity and the extreme importance of maintaining cordial relationships with people in the industry, and the way we're all constantly in surveillance with each other on social media, et cetera, has just created a media industry where cliquishness and sort of the dominance of sort of personal relationships has sort of crowded out everything else, right? Where it's just enormously important for your career that you be well liked by other people in the profession. And one of the things, I mean, you can sort of see that there are a ton of people who have more sort of in-industry prestige than I do, and who have more connections and more opportunity for that reason, whose actual writing is a market failure, right?
Right.
Who
Right.
who don't attract a large audience and who don't have passionate followers the way that I do.
Well, I was going to say, though, there's two conflicting forces, right? So one is the cliquishness, the social functions of the industry. The other is we're also in a moment that rewards voiciness and stars, right? And so one of those you benefit from, and the other ones you really don't benefit from because you're very voicey, you're very good. And the other thing is you're very provocative and you get into fights, which is another thing that drives traffic and attention and clicks. So you're an interesting case in that way.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would look at like, so like you have this sort of crowdfunding rise right now, like Substack, but there's plenty of other alternatives. You know, everyone who sort of makes a living with a crowdfunded newsletter now is accused of thinking that newsletters can replace the old news media. I certainly don't think that, right? Like I was just looking for a life raft, and a lot of people are, you know, in just a collapsing industry. Of course, I don't think that like we can replace all the old, you know, sort of mid-major newspapers that are gone now. But if you sort of look at what's happened as the industry has continued to contract, I mean, just the list of places that have closed, like BuzzFeed News, or, you know, Vice, for all intents and purposes, has shut down its sort of news gathering operations. And like, you can find like, you know, lists of websites. A lot of people have been forced into the position of having to do sort of price discovery for how much they could make on their own. And sometimes you have someone like Matt Iglesias who's making more than $1 million on Substack a year, right? He sort of, this price discovery has been very good for him. And then for other people, price discovery has not been very good for them. And so part of the reason there's this constantly percolating backlash against Substack is that there's people who thought that they would be able to sort of do this and learn that they can't, because their skill set and their professional value was in managing relationships within the industry rather than in like being good at their job, you know?
I mean, there is another category, which is like a very good news reporter who's good at his job is not going to, in most cases, get much buy-in on Substack, right? There are people who are good at their job, but it's a different kind of job than what's rewarded in this space.
Absolutely him. But I've used the example before of like ex-Gawker Media people, right? So in 2016, Gawker Media gets killed off by this lawsuit from Peter Thiel. Gawker itself is a site that, you know, is wildly divisive and did a lot of really genuinely nasty stuff, but also a sort of angry billionaire killing a media publication by funding this fairly frivolous lawsuit in Florida where it had the most possible soft landing, whatever. And that should disturb anyone who cares about freedom of the press. So you have this thing which is like, it was one of the coolest places to work in the industry, even though, you know, they paid very poorly, like so many places did. You have this sort of whole cohort of people who now have to do something else. And I think you can sort of look at ex-Gawker people and you can sort of see a clear divide between like, there's a bunch of ex-Gawker people who have gone on to sort of carve out their own niche and do something cool and interesting. So like Hamilton Nolan has a Substack that is dedicated purely to late organized labor and union issues. And I can tell you, I mean, I promise you that's not an easy beat in terms of like getting clicks and views, but he has gradually built up an enviable subscriber base and can make a living doing it because he's worked in them. And that's somebody sort of taking that opportunity and running with it. And then you have a bunch of ex-Gawker people who are just sort of weird, embittered group that like never get over being ex-Gawker people and just sort of band together and yell into the void. And it's going to be 10 years next year, right? Like you have to move on eventually. But that's a good example of what I'm talking about, which is just that like not everybody who was sort of paid up and highly regarded in sort of media Twitter in 2010s, which was the big sort of organizing committee for the whole industry. Not all of those people are actually equipped to go out there and find people who will trade money for their writing. And as depressed as I am about the state of the industry, because it's terribly depressing, you know, I do admit that like the fact that some people found out that they were essentially being buoyed by their in-group popularity are discovering that actually someone like me is able to make a living because people really like my writing, you know?
I'm curious, this is a little bit of a detour, but it's always struck me that you're weirdly apologetic about writing, about your right. You're like, I just had to take it because I needed the money. Why are you apologetic about it?
Yeah, I mean, it is directly an expression of the fact that, like, I did very sincerely pledge not to write anymore, or not to write in the way that I was anymore, because of what happened, and it not just in terms of it being like a form of penance, but also I'm just clearly terribly sort of arranged as a human being for the social media age, right? Like, I mean, the irony of me spending so many years as a blogger or writing my own newsletter is that like no one benefits more from an editor than me, right? And I don't even mean like in terms of line by line editing, which I often find valuable and sometimes I don't. But I mean just like someone to sort of say, we're not going to publish this, right? Like this piece is not worth publishing. You should take 24 hours and think this one over, decide if you want this, right? It just seemed like at the time, especially because this whole sort of industry collapse and the collapse of Twitter as being what it was in the industry at the time, it all just seemed so poorly suited to who I was as a personality and in terms of my bipolar disorder. So I was sincerely trying to find something else to do. And I think I could have been very happy working at CUNY for the rest of my life as a public servant in a nice unionized job and a terribly underpaid, but job at a beautiful school and like writing books on the side. That would have been fine. It just didn't end up going down that way.
I want to just separate out, I think, two things that I'm sort of curious about. So, okay, so there's the piece of it that's like, hey, maybe this is not good for writing in this space. Maybe this is not good looking at myself from the outside, trying to calculate what would be ideal for sort of my mental, physical, emotional health. This is not optimal. That makes sense to me, and I'm kind of interested in thinking about that. But that's different from being apologetic about it. That's sort of like, okay, I'm trying to make a calculation about spending too much time on Twitter, right? And you know, that's a calculation a lot of us have made, right? Oh, wait a second, like I'm drawn to this thing. It's not good. It makes me a worse version of myself. That I get, but that's different from apologizing for doing it, which is some kind of like, which is to the world or something like that. I'm not sure. Where's the apology come from? I mean, it can't just be that you said you weren't going to do it again. I mean, whatever we say.
No, I mean, I also like sincerely regret everything that happened then, you know, I mean, it's difficult, you know.
Yeah, but didn't you do your time? I mean.
Well, I did do my time, right? I mean, I think.
Like you didn't punch anybody in the face. Like, I understand what you did was like not great, but in the scale of like not great things, like you more than did your time.
Yeah. I mean, look, like, I do think like one of the things that does bother me a lot is, I mean, the people who I've always been antagonistic to, right? I gave them the biggest gift I possibly could have given them in terms of a permanent excuse to sort of dismiss me in this way. They will often say things like, oh, you know, he never really paid any price for it, which is just completely wrong. I paid an immense price. I mean, like I said, my financially, it was devastating. Personally, it was devastating. Professionally at CUNY, it was devastating. I mean, it just closed so many doors for so many years. You know, I thank God that I already had an agent and a book deal before it happened, because I certainly wasn't going to get one afterwards. You know what I'm saying? Like, so, you know, I did pay a cost, and it's been 8 years and I changed my life completely. Yeah. I'm done apologizing for it. I do want people to understand that, like, I didn't sort of willy-nilly say, okay, I'm going to dive back into this because this is where the money is. And I think that it's important for people to understand that, in fact, in large measure, as a direct result of what happened that night, I was in a position in my life where I was just totally boned, right? Like, because people continue to suggest that I didn't pay a price for it. And you say, no, actually, like, I didn't know how I was going to pay the rent. So, like, this was actually very devastating for me.
Hey, so this is the free teaser. If you want to hear the whole thing, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe, at least for this month, and send some moolah my way.